Good evening, and welcome to another Beyond the Walls public lecture series. These events are organized by the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University in collaboration with Oshawa Public Libraries. My name is Jennifer Clark, and I am a Community Engagement and Programs Librarian at Oshawa Public Libraries. And together with my colleagues, Andrea Braithwaite, Jennifer Gardner, and Karen Douglas, it is my pleasure to welcome you. First, I would like to start the evening with a land acknowledgement. The land we are standing on today is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Oshawa is covered under the Williams Treaties, and as a settler on these lands, we are all treaty people. May we respectfully honor the knowledge and understanding of the Indigenous stewards of these ancestral lands and ensure that the voices of the First Peoples are represented in our collections, programs, and services. We encourage everyone with us tonight to become aware of the treaty relationships and traditional territories you're situated in, wherever you may be located. A bit on netiquette. Please keep your mics muted during the presentation. You can put your questions in the chat at any time, and after the presentation, we will address them. Or you are also welcome to raise your virtual hand, and we will call on you to unmute and ask your question. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available in a few days on both the faculty and library's website. There will be a link to a short survey added in the chat shortly, and we encourage you to fill it out to provide us with any feedback on tonight's discussion or any of the past Beyond the Walls lectures. Again, thank you for joining us this evening. I will now turn it over to Andrea for our guest introduction.
Thanks very much, Jen, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm glad you were able to make it. And I would like you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Hoornweg, who is the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Energy Systems and Nuclear Science at Ontario Tech. Dr. Hoornweg studies sustainability, climate change, and natural resources, which are really pressing issues for all of us today. He is also the co-author of a recently released report on sustainability in the Great Lakes, and I'll stick a link to that in the chat in a second. He is here to share with us tonight some of the important questions and insights from this report, as well as some suggestions about how we can think about these issues going forward. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our guest.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Jen and the library for the opportunity. Let me see if I can present this. So, good evening, everyone. And I guess, the first order perhaps to do in any talk about the Great Lakes is to congratulate all of you and all of us and me. We actually won the geography lottery, the world's geography lottery, and we live in probably the most coveted piece of geography in the world today, and that will increase significantly because of climate change and a bunch of other things that maybe we can talk about tonight. So I just wanted to go over quickly a paper that we wrote between Ontario Tech and the Council of the Great Lakes Region on what is arguably the most important region in the world. And maybe before we talk about any specific city, whether it be Oshawa or the region of Durham or the megaregion of the Great Lakes area, it's a useful thing to maybe take a step back and say, what's going on? Like, why is the world, what's happening around the world and why? And these are what I would call sort of the big waves of impacts that are driving what's happening around the world. We've got urbanization. So Canada was one of the first countries to reach that magic 50% urban point way back in 1921. So it's our 100-year anniversary this year, whereas the world overall didn't reach 50% urban until 2008. And the last region, Africa, won't be 50% urban until around 2040. And the reason urban is so important is because that's where the money is. That's where the resources are going. That's the cause of climate change, loss of biodiversity, a lot of things. So urbanization is the biggie, a biggie, one of the three biggest drivers. The other one is demographics. It's hard to confess, but yes, we're all getting older, and we're getting older, especially in Canada. Even worse than us is Russia, Japan. China is aging very fast. And it used to be when when my parents were growing up, pretty well everyone, the countries that called the tune around the world were the OECD, the rich country club. So Europe, Japan, the United States, Canada. We basically ran the world in the 1900s. We created the UN. We paid for much of the rebuilding after World War II. Well, the US did. However, a student graduating today from Ontario Tech is going to be graduating into a very, very different world. 80% of the money made for the rest of this century will be made outside of an OECD country. And that's just staggering. That's just changes everything. We've all sort of seen people chasing the money being made in China, but it'll be India, and then it'll be Africa after that. And then the third big thing is the digital economy, the internet, and how all of that's impacting on things. And then we're starting to see how this is all impacted by degradation of biosystems, so the Great Lakes region, climate change, COVID would be another impact of all of that. So really for us, we need to figure out how to surf, I guess, these big trends. We have these things called the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll just mention them in a bit. And then sort of where the Great Lakes region fits in all of this. And why I think it's a useful thing and a useful exercise maybe to start with COVID as a warm-up to climate change. So this is a report that the Government of Canada prepared, and I have how did we do here, but I don't think I got the tense right. It should be how are we doing. We've seen Omicron is our next little adventure that we have to face. And COVID-19 is really highlighting some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses around the world today and in Canada. And much of those lessons are going to be or are being transferred to climate change now. So what are we learning from COVID? One is that we've got horrendous geopolitical challenges. The WHO, the US fighting with China, we've got high income countries not really sharing effectively vaccine doses. We saw Canada is really not up to the task. All of the data is being collected differently by different provinces. We actually had blockades between the border of Manitoba and Ontario and Quebec, which were unconstitutional, but nobody said anything. We have some challenges there. We've seen the marvels of technology. mRNA is the speed at which the vaccine was developed is unprecedented. We're also seeing that a lot of the heavy lifting of COVID, and it'll be for climate change as well, is falling to the cities. We're also starting to see the border problems popping up between the US and Canada, and between the provinces. And this insiders versus outsiders is intensifying. So you probably saw a few municipalities in the cottage areas were saying, well, we don't want those people from Toronto with their COVID. They should stay home, and all sorts of these issues. And that is probably, well, I'm pretty sure it is not going to go away. That when people are afraid and things are changing, people get fearful. They tend to become more insular, more tribal, and we're starting to see that. We're also starting to see things like anti-vaxxers, climate deniers, where having the right answer or the right science is not nearly enough. Okay, so this is a famous figure from a paper that was in Nature that everybody quotes in every sustainability talk. And this is Johan Rockström, a smart Swede who works for the Stockholm Environment Institute, is basically saying, where are we overshooting the planetary boundaries? Where are we most in trouble? And the only reason I put this up here, and this is, you've probably all heard the term now, the Anthropocene. This is, We were living in the Holocene, which was sort of the Goldilocks climate, and then humans have perturbed that, and now we're headed into, or we are, in the Anthropocene, which is basically the climate in the world environment that humans have made, basically. Anyways, climate change is really one of only 4 or 5, because this table has been updated, areas where we're out of whack with regards to planetary boundaries. The big one really is biodiversity loss. That's probably the one that has more, well, it's kind of, they're all pretty bad, I guess. Biodiversity, climate change, nitrogen. Anyways, lots of issues that we're facing. And the reason climate change is a good one to start with, and why it's what we call sort of the first wicked problem that we've had to deal with, is, well, this slide sums it up really well. And I'm sorry it's a bit out of date, and it's out of date because in this slide, Canada's per capita greenhouse gas emissions are shown to be lower than the United States. And sadly, we have overtaken the US. We are now, on this chart, we are the largest per capita greenhouse gas emitters in the world, by quite a lot, actually. And the thing that I wanted to show here that I think is really important is, you see the pie, you got an orange and a red and a yellow slice of pie. The yellow slice of pie represents all of the emissions from the low-income countries of the world. So all of Africa, all of India, much of East Asia, South Asia, about 3 billion people. 3 billion people are emitting about 2 to 3% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, whereas 1.5 billion of us rich people are generating more than half of the emissions. And this is only annual emissions. If you did cumulative emissions, it would be even worse. So there's a big chunk of the world way over there on the right-hand side of the chart, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, who are basically contributing nothing to the climate change problem, but are the ones who are going to have to deal with it the soonest and the most severe impacts. And I love this picture. I found this a few years ago. I don't love it. I just find it's very poignant. So this is a kid named Bethu that I found his picture just surfing the internet one day on Al Jazeera, and I was struck by. So I'm pretty sure that that's a hand-me-down T-shirt from the Ontario's Union Pearson Express. Bethu lives in Beira, Mozambique, and he was taken out of school at age 13. He wanted to be an engineer, so I'm not sure how clever that is. But anyways, he was taken out of school for that. Taken out of school by his family to sell those oranges, and I just wrote it down here. He sells 1 orange every 2 hours, and he makes 5 cents an hour. So here's a kid who's pretty smart. He and his sister were both taken out of school to sell oranges at 5 cents an hour. Now, he lives in Beira, Mozambique. Now, you may have heard of Beira, Mozambique. It was in the news a little while ago, when March 2019. Basically, for 3 years, 2 years after this picture was taken, Bethu's house was completely destroyed. 600,000 people in Beira, Mozambique lost their houses, 260,000 children homeless from Cyclone Ida. Cyclone Ida was the most intense cyclone ever to hit the Southern Hemisphere. Most of us have never heard of it. Basically completely destroyed Bethu's town. And the thing that I just think is important for us, in sort of comfy Great Lakes region to keep in mind is that there are 200 million Bethus in the world. Kids who are taken out of school because they don't have enough money or for one reason or another. And I think it's important to remember that as Bethu grows up and Bear is gone, he's got really nothing to lose or nothing to financially. And he's pretty intelligent, and he's going to get angrier and angrier, and he's going to start looking for who's to blame for climate change. And I think as Canadians and as sort of that left-hand side, the big part of that pie, we need to be cognizant of the fact that there's a lot of people who are going to get a lot more angry about the state of the world than we have today. So that's why investing, for example, in vaccines, I think, is one of the best investments you can make. It's like if you treat your neighbor well, or when things aren't totally bad, it's a whole lot easier to get along when things get worse. And I think they will get worse. So we did this spiffy report, and as mentioned, you can get the paper for free. It's a bargain at any price, but free is good. And um, the Great Lakes region is this little, well, it's not little, it's this amazing geological artifact, the last ice ages that left this amazing ecosystem of the Great Lakes. You've heard all of the superlatives about 70% of North America's fresh water and how it supports 107 million people live in the Great Lakes region. If it was a country, it would be the third largest country, third most affluent country in the world. It has driven more technology, more economy, more ways of the world, if you will, modern world, in terms of electricity, AC electricity, in terms of all sorts of technologies, buildings. The first skyscraper was built in Chicago, all these sorts of things driven by the Great Lakes region. Canada-US Auto Pact, it solidified Canada's economy. It's a big deal. It's hard to emphasize or overstate how big a deal the economy of the Great Lakes region is for anchoring both the US and Canada, and arguably the world today. But not surprisingly, and I'm sure all of you know, the Great Lakes have been severely damaged by people and events. And this picture on the bottom right is the other area that always gets a lot of attention, especially in the US, is California. And the first big Earth Day, this is the one for Chicago. This was, Earth Day was still today, the largest collection of people in the US Mall, Washington, DC. And Earth Day is what created Environment Canada, what created the Environmental Protection Act in Canada. It's what created the EPA in the US, the International Joint Commission for the Protection of the Great Lakes. That all came about in the 70s when people, it was two things that drove, really, were the catalyst for Earth Day. One was the Cuyahoga River caught on fire for the fifth time, actually. But it was the fifth time when people said, you can't have rivers catching on fire. That's crazy. There was a funeral in the 1972. It was the start of pollution probe for Lake Erie with phosphorus. It was basically killed. And the other big event was a big oil spill off of California. And that was what got people basically to say, enough is enough. We want some action. And I'm kind of reminded of today's, the Greta Thunbergs and the protests. We're kind of at the same place. It's just that we're 50 years later and not much has happened other than we've emitted an awful lot of greenhouse gas emissions in those intervening 50 years. But this time I think it might be different. And I want to make a case and see if you buy it, that it may very well be the Great Lakes region again that drives the global, catalyzes, I guess is a better way of putting it, the global response to climate change and broad environmental degradation. Okay, this is this picture that everybody who works on real estate in the future downloads and looks at and sort of says, wow, okay, where should I invest? And the climate change is already changing the way and the place where people live. And as you can see, the red marks on this map, the red and orange areas, are those areas that are getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and people are moving away from. So Syria was the first big climate refugee event that we had, and they are just intensifying. And where people want to move to are the areas in green. The areas in green, so Russia and Canada, and the part about the Great Lakes that everybody wants to move to is that we have lots of fresh water. We have enough fresh water to get us through climate change for at least the next 75 to 100 years. So the pressures on real estate and people wanting to move to the Great Lakes is increasing, and it's going to increase faster and faster. So this is, I just wanted to show that we actually did the numbers, but we don't have to really look at them, but they're all in this report. And this is the 76 metrics that we looked at to try and define sustainability of the Great Lakes. And this is doing the same thing. And we remember that diagram I showed from Rockstrom. We just kind of stole his idea and did it for cities and for the Great Lakes broadly. So this is Chicago up at the top, Detroit, Montreal, Toronto. And you can see for almost all of them, it's climate change that's the biggie from the biophysical and land use change. And then this is looking at, this is the Sustainable Development Goals, which are kind of like the, it's the playbook of the United Nations right now, and all the environmental groups and all of the people, all those 35,000 people who went to COP26 who weren't allowed into the meetings to discuss, but they were outside protesting and demanding action. They're demanding action among these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So one of them is climate, one of them is water, equity, peace, infant mortality, all these big issues. And when you plot those 17 goals for the Great Lakes region, where we need to put the most attention is climate change, biodiversity, and land use change. And not just land use change in the Great Lakes, but we also have to start thinking about if we are eating, let's say, a hamburger in Oshawa, we need to be able to figure out if that came from the rainforest in Brazil and count all of that from start to finish. And when you start doing that, you start realizing just how big of an impact 107 million people who on average generate 19 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per year, how big of an impact that is globally. Okay, so one of the things that popped up in COP26 and has been growing and growing is cities and regions, and not just the region of Durham, but also the mega region of the Great Lakes, are starting to realize that a lot of this heavy lifting is up to them. We've traditionally always relied on the nation state, where it's the government of Canada tells us, it oversees our currency and our passport and these sorts of things. But for real substantive, meaningful impacts, increasingly it's our local governments that are driving much of the change. And that's starting to sink in. Okay. And so really, I mean, that's another way of, and part of the reason cities are so important is because that's where all the rich people live, and that's where all the economy and the innovation takes place. So about 10% or 80% of all of the world's energy is used by or for cities. And although cities are sort of around the world creatures of senior governments, really it's the other way. It's time to some extent to look the other way and say, it's the 8,000 local governments of the Great Lakes region that have paid for much of the operation of the US government and the government of Canada. And that's starting to change a bit. There's all this, slicing and dicing of cities. We have Oshawa, we have Whitby, We have Ajax, which is that little square cut out of, Pickering. Makes no sense really, right? But it's all done so that each of the local governments kind of fights with each other enough over, seemingly scarce resources. But what's happening more and more is the cities are seeing that it isn't each other that is the biggest challenge. It's how they cooperate with others around the world that needs the most attention. And COVID is one of those things that is showing that yeah, we can make sure that we provide vaccines in Toronto or Oshawa or whatever. But if we don't get vaccines to the poor people in Africa, then we're just kidding ourselves. And urban regions, cities tend to be that sweet spot of action where you can actually get things happening, changing the way we live. Okay, so this is Toronto region. So Oshawa is in the Toronto region. Durham is in the Toronto region, although we love to say we hate being part of the Toronto, but the world sees Oshawa as part of the greater Toronto Hamilton area. And for Toronto, the big priority is transportation. It is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's also the single largest cause of inefficient resource consumption. We have big houses because we have a lot of space. They take up a lot of energy. They use a lot of materials. We create more waste per person in Canada than any other country in the world. It's all we use more energy than any other people in the world. It's all kind of related. We are a very resource intensive country, and that is the big thing that needs to change for the Great Lakes region, is how to rein in energy usage and material use. And for us, it's coming up with a better model for transportation. This is just the same thing as before, but for Toronto, we don't have. And so just to sort of summarize what the sustainability of the Great Lakes perspective is, that is probably one of the, if not the most important geographies historically for driving environmental awareness. And I would say, as important as awareness, the Great Lakes region has driven environmental action. It's the region that basically forced the creation of environmental assessments in both Canada and the US. The Environmental Protection Agency in the US, Environment Canada, was created because the people of Quebec and Ontario basically demanded it over the preservation of the Great Lakes. It's also unfortunately, one of the best places in the world to see how big of an impact humans have had on sort of our pristine environments that we had before the settlers came, I suppose. So, for example, lamprey, zebra mussels, all of these things that we've introduced by accident into the Great Lakes have played havoc with the ecosystem. We came really close to killing off Lake Erie with phosphates and causing the eutrophication. We're seeing already impacts of climate change on the cottage lakes, the smaller lakes around the Great Lakes, the Muskokas, the blue-green algae that we're starting to experience as the temperatures get higher and more waste is put into the lakes. So, and there's 46 areas of significant environmental impacts that have been identified. Funding came about. So in the US, the whole super fund to clean up environmental hotspots was all created from the Great Lakes, even though there were other areas, but it was the Great Lakes that drove it through Love Canal. There are more hazardous waste buried along the Niagara River than the rest of the US and Canada combined, and that all came about from cheap electricity and industries. We've started to deal with that, but we haven't come anywhere close to dealing with it. Also, I'd say that the Great Lakes, another big thing is that 107 million people that drive the economies of Canada and the US is sufficient heft to again change the world. I think the Great Lakes did change the world over the last 50 years. and they're about to do it again. And I just hope it's, it's effective and for the good. We're starting to see climate change, how it's impacting the Great Lakes. We're moving towards lower carbon electricity, hydrogen. We're trying to come up with a price on vehicle travel, even though everybody hates tolls. We know that it's kind of the way to go. And we're trying to become more efficient, which is a big deal. And then the other thing that we're seeing is climate change adaptation, where we're already seeing immigration into the area, climate refugees. We're trying to increase the resilience of people and communities. Everybody in the Great Lakes region, well, everybody everywhere in the world, in Canada, should be able to survive on their own for at least 72 hours. So if the power goes out at your house, the goal is that everybody should have 72 hours of self-sufficiency, which is pretty tough. We have, it's hard to feed 107 million people. We're already seeing sort of the problems with the distribution chains for food. So that's an area that needs attention. And then we also know what the priorities are, which it's easy to, when you look at Lake Superior, for example, or you look at 107 million people, or you try and drive around the Great Lakes, you just think, wow, they're so big that it's, we can't really impact them that much. But that's really deceiving. The Great Lakes are 99% of the water in the Great Lakes just sits there every year. Only 1% is circulated. So the Great Lakes are a holdover, a souvenir of glaciation, and they're very, very vulnerable, fragile. So, for example, we know that the Asian carp are just one barrier away from being accidentally introduced into the Great Lakes, which would cause more havoc than lamprey. But we're still pretty sanguine about it. I don't think we're taking it seriously enough. We're not yet at a point where the Great Lakes are receiving the attention that they need to be safeguarded for another 50 to 100 years. We're also starting to see priorities. Quebec and Ontario need to learn how to cooperate better. The US states, we already are starting to see some of the political friction among different states. Interesting politically, the US states are almost equal, around the Great Lakes are almost equally divided every election between 50% Democrat, 50% Republican. It's scary, eerie how closely 50-50 it is. Also, it's like the 905 of Canada. It's just Ontario, but the 905 basically determines which government, whether it's Liberal, Conservative, or NDP. Between Ontario and Quebec, that's almost 70% of all of the seats in Ottawa are between those two provinces. And we need to be able to figure out how to accommodate, I would say, at least 50 million new people wanting to move to the Great Lakes region between now and the end of the century. And then the last point is, Earth Day. The first Earth Day, 1972, was in mostly the Great Lakes. And it seems that we might be getting close to another Earth Day, but it'll be I think it's a bit more global this time. And hopefully the Great Lakes will lead in terms of sustainability, both at home and globally. And that's it. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. This has been really eye-opening, and I have jotted down a bunch of questions, but I don't want to hog all of the question spotlight. So I would love to turn it over to our guests and have them go first. Okay, let's start with Jen. What happened to make Canada surpass the US in emissions?
Okay, I might get in trouble for this, but in a word, well, two words: oil sands. Canada's emissions have gone up significantly from oil and gas development in Alberta and Saskatchewan. I would also say that that's one, but I would say that it's the second. The first biggest impact has been the size of vehicles in Canada has increased more than anywhere else in the world. Canada's vehicles are the most greenhouse gas emitting in the world per vehicle and per distance traveled. So I would say that that's actually the biggest one, is that we basically let the cars get away from us, that we've all moved to SUVs and trucks, and that's had a big impact. And then second is oil and gas. And then third might be that, I mean, Canada's been really lucky, is really lucky, because we have so much low carbon electricity. So we have hydro in BC, Manitoba, Ontario. We're the only one of the few places in the world where you go, people call electricity hydro, and it's because it started from hydroelectricity. And then we had low carbon nuclear, and then hydro in Quebec and Newfoundland. So we have a very low carbon electricity, but we've made up for it in emissions in mostly transportation, but also home. We have big homes, lots of natural gas, very inefficient home heating. We're also, person for person, we're the largest energy consumers in the world, which is not a good thing. We love to say, oh, it's because we're big and cold, but it's really because we're lazy and inefficient, I guess, is equally true as big and cold, I guess.
Thank you. Okay, not seeing anything from anyone else yet. I will jump in with one of mine. On one of your earlier slides, you had an image of the Great Lakes with like a sliding scale of cumulative stress on the lakes. And I was curious what accounts for the big difference between the substantial stress on Lake Ontario and Lake Erie and the much less stress on Lake Superior.
Yes, great question. So Lake Superior is bigger, deeper, and colder, and it has fewer people living around it. And that's basically it. Whereas Lake Erie is really quite shallow compared to the other lakes. And it's why Lake Erie was, it was Pollution Probe got its start by holding an official funeral for Lake Erie. It was all but declared, well, it was declared dead from eutrophication from all of the phosphorus from soaps and shampoos and farmers' fields in Lake Erie. There's one big algal bloom, and that was in the 60s and the 70s, and that was because it's just so shallow. There's also, the areas that we've done the most damage locally are things like Hamilton Harbor. Terrible levels of pollution in Hamilton Harbor that were there. Collingwood Harbor, Chicago, the Cuyahoga River that caught on fire, Ohio, all of those areas where there was significant levels of industrialization. All of that stuff was just dumped into the lakes, and it's still trying to recover. And then the big one really was lamprey and zebra mussels have done more damage in Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, basically because they got there first. So that's basically it. Lake Superior should be, tends to be, the colder the lake, the better. One of the big things for climate change, though, is that the lakes will be increasing temperature, and that exacerbates all of the impacts. So that's the big worry from limnologists, the people studying the lakes. They're quite concerned about how are they going to react to climate change.
We've seen a lot over the past couple of years, a lot of exodus from Toronto out into cottage country, out into the Kawarthas and the Muskokas that have all of these much smaller lakes. And so what should we be aware of, and what can we learn from all of these smaller lakes in cottage country that we can sort of take as lessons for how we treat our water?
Hmm. Oh, yeah, there's a lot there, I guess. One, I think many of the people who are leaving the Toronto area are being replaced by people who want to move to the Toronto area. So I also think that it's just human nature to be kind of an us and them, or an insider and an outsider. But if ever there were sort of the flip side to a coin, there is no real difference in my mind between the Toronto 905 and the Muskoka areas, because the Muskoka, basically the communities owe much of their economy to people from Toronto, and vice versa. People in Toronto owe much of their quality of life to having the lakes close by. So it's we're all in this together, I guess, is one big point. Another point, for the smaller lakes especially, all of the really sought after lakes in Ontario for cottaging. Um, Now, Andrea Kirkwood would know this much better at Ontario Tech. She studies the lakes, but almost all of the lakes are basically glacial puddles that, when the glaciers melted, they left these puddles of, Lake Joseph and Lake of Bays. That's why there are always those funny shapes on the Canadian Shield, um, which is just a big puddle of water sitting on top of granite. So there's very little buffering capacity. So, for example, the lakes around Sudbury all died from the emissions from smelting in Sudbury. And so that's where acid rain all started. And it was all studied because the lakes are so small, they can't take much abuse before trouble happens. So we're already seeing in a few lakes in cottage country blue-green algae blooms, which are, we've seen cases of dogs dying because they jump in the water and drink it. So what I think we'll see is probably tightening of environmental protection for the lakes. We'll probably see things like, people will have to put in more effort to make sure that the waste from their cottage, which becomes more and more a year-round dwelling, so the septic system has to be improved. We're going to see things like, I would think we'll see within 10 years, we'll see electric boats, so that we get the gas out of gas and a bit of the quiet. We're already seeing loon populations being impacted by the number of people. We will probably see more controls on fishing. We'll try and keep the numbers up. We'll probably see less hunting. I don't know in terms of which area, depending on the bird population. And we'll probably see an overall, I don't know, kind of a better appreciation on the fragility of the lakes. And I know that sounds kind of flaky, but I think people will, in 30 years' time, I predict that no cottage owner will ever cut their grass within 30 feet of the lake, for example. That's just one of those things you just don't do, but a lot of people still do. We'll see things like, because the challenge in most of our cottage lakes is that they're so small that only a few little impacts make a big difference. So the little impacts, we have to figure a way to make them smaller. So smaller cottage or smaller docks with smaller boats, all this kind of stuff. But I do think we'll see a lot more people wanting to live out there. So we'll see high-speed internet. We'll see all sorts of things. We'll see some, people living in Muskoka, but probably much more moving back and forth between the seasons. We're already seeing, the new train that the provincial government started to go up to North Bay. We'll see more of that. We'll see, I think, a high-speed bus going up and down the 400 to Sudbury to try and make it possible that you can't only get to the cottage in your car, also public transit. Yeah. And then, oh, the one other big thing I think we'll have to figure out, again, it's back to this whole transportation thing, is less salt on the roads, having a big impact on the lakes.
That is a fantastic segue to the question we have in the chat from Aiden. We need to reduce our transportation impact on the environment. What effects are in the works to reduce our transportation effects? How much more is needed?
Well, a lot more is needed. So I like it. I often sort of Canadians love to make fun of Americans for their hold on guns, right? With the NRA, and we say, we just don't get it. And a lot of people look at Canadians and make fun of us about how addicted we are to automobiles. You can't go to the cottage unless you have a car right now. We all need a car almost. And I think, so what's happening more and more is improved transit, electric bikes. COVID has had a big impact. We don't like getting in subways and cars with strangers and these sorts of things. But assuming that COVID eventually ends one day, we're going to figure out how to look at transportation as an integrated system, as opposed to Ontario especially is really bad, I guess, at whenever there's a problem, we add a lane to the highway, or Highway 413. Oh, there's a problem here. Let's add a new highway. And we know, as transportation engineers, we know that just doesn't work. It's like adding more food to the buffet for people on diets. To say, well, there's more to choose from, so people, it's going to be easier for their diet. It doesn't work that way. We need to add things like rideshare, rapid transit, and we're going to have the one thing that will come, and I can make a prediction. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I do know that we will be shifting to all vehicles will be charged for distance traveled on the roads. A little bit like the 407, but for all roads. And the reason I predict this is things like deliveries. So we have a house in downtown Toronto, and I remember sitting there one day in the front porch and just counting the delivery vehicles. And there were more than 30 delivery vehicles passed before our front door before the end of the day. And that is just such a admission of failure in terms of inefficiency. And the inefficiency is that nobody's charging those vehicles to use the road. So the argument has always been, well, the gas tax pays for that. But it doesn't, because the emissions from the vehicles are a significant source of air pollution and respiratory problems. And it makes no sense, but if you don't charge to travel on the roads, of course you'll get 30 delivery vehicles passing by your house a day. Whereas if somebody came up with a system to put them all those packages in the same vehicle, it would be one delivery. That sort of was the idea behind mail, I suppose, at one point, but we're going to have to do that again. Similarly, we're going to have to figure out how, if you have a vehicle with 4 people that's relatively small versus a huge a Humvee or something, that the price that you pay to operate on the road is different. And the reason, to a large extent, that this will change is because the excuse that we haven't done it has been the gasoline tax. All the governments have said, well, and people will say, well, I shouldn't have to pay for using the roads because I pay through the gasoline tax. Well, one, gasoline tax pays a fraction of the costs of using our roads. But two, we've got all of these governments pushing us to buy electric vehicles. That once you start using electric vehicles, there's no gasoline tax anymore. And it's a significant source of revenue for government. So they're going to have to replace that source of revenue. And the best thing for us, even though we won't like it, it's kind of like going to the dentist for your checkup, I suppose, or eating our vegetables, will be to say, yes, we want some kind of a fee per distance traveled on the road. So by 2035, every vehicle sold in Canada, probably starting with trucks, will have a GPS. They'll monitor and you'll get a bill every month or whatever it is for how much distance you traveled on the road, and you pay for that. That's one way. And then while you bring that in, you also bring in better transit, an app for everybody's phone that it's easy to get from wherever you want to go. I mean, it makes no sense that it is easier to get in a car and drive from downtown Toronto to Ontario Tech than it is to take transit. It's a badly designed system. And the reason it's so hard to change is because we have so many competing interests that want things to stay the way they are. So we'll get there, but it won't be easy, I guess. It's probably more of an answer than you wanted on transportation, but
Are there specific changes or choices that individuals can make that are steps in the right direction? I'm just thinking because you mentioned, well, the one that really jumped out at me for purely selfish reasons is not mowing lawns near shorelines, right? And so are there, and I'm really curious as to know why, because if I can get out of that chore, I will. Um, and and so are there other, yeah, like choices and stuff like that we can all individually start working towards?
oh, many, I would think. Although some of it's also, so I would say yes, there are many, but I would say that either the first or the last one is that, the oil companies were great, Exxon and BP, when people were talking about climate change and fossil fuels, they kind of made it as if it was up to us as individuals to fix this. And yes, we need to do things individually to fix it, but we also need to push a little bit like Earth Day 50 years ago and the Greta Thunbergs of the world, is we need to push for more common sense in government without polarizing things. So let me give sort of maybe what I think are some of the things, the quick things personally, might be things like uh, the region of Durham should say that by such and such a date, no new homes should be heated by natural gas. They should all be either air source or ground source heat pumps. Just so much more efficient. Natural gas, we don't need it for heating. Those are the sorts of things. We should be looking at recharge ponds, trying to save the runoff water before it gets into the, to slow it down so that it recharges groundwater and we have less flooding. But we also need to do collective things that at the moment come across as political issues, but shouldn't. And I'll give an example. Highway 413 is a stupid idea. And it doesn't matter if you're conservative, it doesn't matter if you're liberal, it is not a good idea from a transportation perspective, but it's being driven by different reasons. And it needs to be looked at much more holistically, that, that much money applied to other transportation initiatives would have significantly higher benefits. But as soon as we get into this discussion, we run into trouble. Like I'm probably already in trouble for saying this about a conservative party versus the liberal party. It was the liberals that killed the tolls on the Don Valley. We need to get away from the politicization of common sense when it comes to some of these big issues. And that's really difficult, but it's really important. There's the Mayor LaGuardia said it best, I think. He said that there's no Democrat and no Republican way to pick up the garbage. And some of these issues need political consensus. And it doesn't matter what side of the spectrum you're on. It just needs and we as individuals need to push for that. But we often get caught up in, it becomes pretty tribal in a hurry where we fight for one side or another. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to get there, but I know that that's important. It's a good issue between, people in cottage country. As more and more people want to move out there, there's going to be more and more resentment, and that's not going to help.
We've got like a minute and a half left. If anybody has a final rapid fire question. All right. It's kind of like when class ends early and we all celebrate. I want to, okay, there's the link to the report again in case you missed it in the chat earlier so folks can follow up. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. This has been really important and interesting, and I am so glad that you could share the important takeaways from this report with us tonight. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.